Hey guys, so I thought I would use a different style this time. I'm gonna use some notes just because I want to try to engage a little bit better. So I wanted to elaborate on my first video. So a lot of you were asking, how do we know that Trump is to blame for the increase in right-wing extremist violence, and what about violence from the left? So I guess first I should probably explain that while I'm a PhD student in history, studying the history of US foreign relations, I also study the history of national security. And on top of that, I do some political science work on political violence, specifically insurgency and terrorism. And while much of my political science work tends to focus on things like jihadist insurgencies specifically, I know and read the work of a bunch of people who study right-wing extremism and extremism in general in the American context. And so I'm able to, understand what's going on in our current climate. So that's what this is based on. And of course, all of my sources are going to be in the description as per usual. So first, let's kind of talk about this whole question of violence on the left, which Trump really loves to deflect with that, right? So there's been very little of that overall. According to the most rigorous data that we have, there really just has not been a lot of violence from the left in recent years. Only recently there's been about one fatality that's been clearly linked to the left. And obviously any one is bad, but it's not nearly as big of a deal as much higher casualty rates as we'll see shortly. So most people who criticize the Black Lives Matter movement and things like that, they think of protests and riots as terrorism. It's important to note that riots are really a qualitatively different type of violence than terrorism is. And even then, over 93% of these protests for Black Lives Matter this year were peaceful. And that's based on data that we have from the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, or ACLID, and that's a very well-respected project, as is the Crowd Counting Consortium, both of which are used by social scientists all the time to study political violence and things of that nature. Now, no data is perfect, but I've actually gone through some of the ACLID data on the protests, and it was pretty good. And there's no doubt in my mind that it has improved since I checked a month and a half ago. So over 93% of these protests are peaceful based on these data sets that we have, made up of thousands of data points. And about half of the violence that did occur at these protests was initiated by counter-protesters or police. It's also unclear how many people who were with the protesters that did initiate violence, how many of them were actually opportunists, just opportunists who are looking to get in there and do some looting or what have you. And also, property damage is very, very different from killing people. It's important to note. Less than 40 people have died in the protests this year. Now, any death is a tragedy, but first of all, it hasn't always been entirely clear who has killed them. And even when we did know, it wasn't usually someone who was clearly linked to the protests. Actually, more people died in riots in Newark, Chicago, and Los Angeles in the 1960s. In each one of those riots, more people died than have died in total during this year because of the Black Lives Matter protests. And that was back in the 1960s, those riots. So comparatively speaking, the violence that we have seen this year really is not that bad. And before you say, well, you're mitigating their deaths by comparing them to other cases, well, ask yourself whether you say the same thing about COVID in reference to other illnesses, which, by the way, COVID has killed 230,000 of your countrymen since March alone. There's also been examples of non-protesters, the people who are trying to be provocateurs, so white nationalists and things like that, sneaking in and engaging in some of the violence and vandalism to actually stir things up. Now, you don't have to take my word for any of this. Go ahead, check my sources. You might say, well, aren't, rioting and looting and burning, aren't they terrorism? Well, terrorism doesn't have a uniform definition, even within the US government, but it usually boils down to a few key factors. So first, there's violence or the threat of violence, especially that type of violence that can result in death. Also, it is inherently political. It's used to try to achieve a social or political goal. It's typically against a non-combatant target. And this is the really important one. It's used to communicate terror or create psychological terror or fear to a broader audience beyond the immediate target of the attack. That is the thing that really sets terrorism apart. And if you try to apply that definition, that general definition to the rioting and whatnot, it really doesn't work. Now, this is not to say overall that the left hasn't been violent, but it is to say that the protests that we've seen this year, to which most people refer when they say, oh, the left is violent too, really, it's fascinating because it kind of supports, the data supports both perceptions to a certain extent. So there's the perception that they're largely peaceful. That is correct, based on the data, over 93% peaceful. However, to a certain extent, when people say, oh, the protests are so violent, the vast majority of them are not. However, there's good support for why they perceive that, partly because of news coverage, but also partly because there has been a lot more violence in the United States because of these riots. And it also is true that the left has become much more violent this year than it was previously, but a lot of that violence appears to be defensive. For example, a lot of Antifa violence in Portland that happened before this year was usually when they encountered the Proud Boys. And the Proud Boys were normally the ones that started the violence. And again, Antifa has killed one person. One. And trust me, I've looked for other instances, and there are none that can be clearly tied to leftist ideology. What about violence on the right, since this is kind of my main point? So there's been a drastic increase since the 2016 election. This is not an opinion. This is not my opinion. This is based on hard data from numerous studies. Look at that spike around 2016. That is absolutely colossal, okay? So why is that? Well, I think it has a lot to do with Donald Trump, especially his rhetoric. Now, some people will say, well, how can you blame Trump for violence that's happened on the right? There's a couple crazies everywhere, they're gonna justify it however they want to, blah, 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 blah. Well, that's absurd because there are so many people who have been saying this, that about the dog whistles, about his rhetoric since 2015, 2016, and he doesn't stop. Also, we've seen how they respond. White nationalists love it. There has been a case, Cesar Sayoc sent bombs to some people who he perceived as Trump's enemies, and his defense lawyer said, look at the president's rhetoric. This is where he got this from. Also, the El Paso shooter, a lot of his rhetoric was very Trumpian. It was very Trump-like. And there's been others too. So, I mean, if they're citing him or if they're sounding a lot like him, that tells you a lot, right? So there's two options when you're considering this whole issue. You can either say that Trump doesn't know what he's saying, or that his words don't carry that kind of weight and do not form any sort of influence or causal mechanism. The first one, if he doesn't know what he's saying, he's not fit for office because that means he's stupid and or reckless. So that does not work for your argument at all. If he does know what he's saying, he is not fit for office because he incites violence. And the evidence strongly suggests that he does, and that it is a causal mechanism, okay? So for example, there's this one study demonstrating that, quote, Trump's tweets about Islam-related topics predict increases in xenophobic tweets by his followers, cable news attention to Muslims, and hate crimes on the following days, end quote. Okay, you can go read the study for yourself. Even if you think, okay, well, Ben, that seems a little bit doubtful, a little bit specious. Okay, well, how about this? There has been a massive uptick in hate crimes, including violent assaults against Asian Americans during COVID. Why? Trump keeps on regularly calling it the China virus and the Kung flu, despite being repeatedly warned that it is a dog whistle. He just keeps doing it because somehow that's going to really stick it to the Chinese government. Now, of course, he's not fully responsible for all of these incidents, right? But he clearly doesn't care that people follow his lead. Even the UN recently said that he's been, quote, seemingly legitimizing hate crimes against Asian Americans through his rhetoric. He has also repeatedly endorsed violence against his political opponents. And there are a lot of examples of this, but I'm just going to stick to a handful. Well, really to one in particular. So in the midst of the, some of the lockdown, the COVID lockdown protests and things like that, on April 17th, Trump tweets, liberate Michigan. He tweets, liberate Minnesota. He also tweets, liberate Virginia. What do those three states have in common? They are run by Democratic governors. This is completely inappropriate, and it's tantamount to inciting insurrection against the governors, okay? He had explicitly given power to the governors to handle COVID as they saw fit, so that makes even less sense, right? But he specifically targeted those Democratic governors because he knew it would be popular with his supporters. Well, you say, what does that matter? It's not a big deal, right? Well, no, it is a big deal because on May 1st, armed protesters stormed the Michigan State House, some saying they would kill the governor. You starting to see a problem here? Well, no one died, Ben. Well, okay, how about this? In June, a right-wing group started plotting terrorist attacks, including one to kidnap, put on trial, and execute the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer. There also have been plots that were uncovered against Governor Ralph Northam, the governor of Virginia, and the Republican governor of Ohio, Mike DeWine. The FBI arrested the conspirators against Whitmer in October, and the same day that those charges were announced, Trump attacked Whitmer when she said that Trump was complicit in it because of his rhetoric, which he clearly was. Then this happened at a rally that he held in Michigan.
You got to get your governor to open up your state, okay? And get your schools open. Get your schools open. The schools have to be open, right? Lock them all up.
Oh, and there's this from this past week, also from a rally in Michigan.
Now, your governor, I don't think she likes me too much. Hey, I'm the one, it was our people that helped her out with her problem. I mean, we'll have to see if it's a problem, right? People are entitled to say maybe it was a problem, maybe it wasn't.
Remember when presidents used to condemn terrorists? Me too. Those were quaint times. His whole law and order line is complete nonsense because it only applies to those with whom he disagrees. In fact, law and order have actually seemingly gone down in the United States under the Trump administration. For example, there have been more terrorist attacks in the United States under his administration at a time when terrorist attacks worldwide were going down, according to the Global Terrorism Database. Just look at that data. Additionally, there has been a marked increase in threats against federal judges under Trump's administration. This data comes from the U.S. Marshal Service and CNN. Now, of course, correlation is not causation, but it definitely helps. Trump has not acted against right-wing extremists in any significant way. He's actually decreased support, like government support, for countering violent extremism efforts and things like that. In fact, former Trump administration officials claim that there was actually an unwritten policy against mentioning things like domestic terrorism and white supremacy around Trump because apparently he took those as personal criticism, which kind of says it all. Then, of course, there's his stand back and stand by comment during the first debate when he was talking about the Proud Boys, or the fact that the Proud Boys have been functioning as security for Republicans in Florida in some sort of brown shirt fashion, which is insane, or the fact that Trump has been quite vocal in issuing very conveniently vague instructions to his supporters to engage in what he calls poll watching, which has already resulted in several cases of voter intimidation, which isn't surprising considering that he refers to his poll watchers as a Trump army, or Army for Trump. You should never be using that sort of militarized language in connection to an election. That's fundamentally un-American. Even the Department of Homeland Security warns that right-wing extremists are the biggest internal threat that we face right now, especially at election time. And every report that I've seen from the government and from extremism analysts indicates that there will likely be violence on election day, and the biggest threat for those is from right-wing extremists and militia groups, especially those individuals who Trump has literally enlisted in his voter intimidation project. Again, Army for Trump. He literally calls for people to enlist today. So what do I expect to happen? Well, if Trump wins, I would imagine there probably won't be comparatively as much initial violence. There will be some, but probably not as much as if he loses, which I'll get to in a minute. But right-wing extremists will see themselves as validated, and they'll become increasingly bold. And they'll start perpetrating even more attacks over the course of his second term. which will then provoke more of a response from the left, just like it did in 2016. And then suddenly it becomes this tit for tat thing, and it escalates and builds, and it gets really nasty really fast. I think you can imagine how that might go. If Biden wins or the election is contested, I expect to see a lot of violence from the right, mostly from the right, around Election Day. Although there will also be some from the left. But Biden will work to combat both in his administration. After all, the Obama administration did not go easy on Antifa. It was Obama's Department of Homeland Security and FBI that initially described some of Antifa's actions as domestic terrorist violence as early as 2016. That's right, Mr. Trump. Obama beat you to the punch on Antifa. Trump doesn't show any inclination to abide by the norms that have made us such a great democracy, as seen in Trump's refusal to commit to a peaceful transfer of power if he should lose. He makes accusations of voter fraud without evidence that it's happening in a systematic fashion. What few anecdotal pieces of evidence he can give shows that it's actually being reported and dealt with immediately when it does happen, which again, very few instances of it actually happening. So claiming that, well, I'd be skeptical too of the election results, it really doesn't work here. The FBI and other intelligence officials have actually said there's no evidence that there is widespread voter fraud. And additionally, even if there was widespread voter fraud, which again, there's not, that would not constitute a reason to basically threaten violence by saying that you won't commit to a peaceful transfer of power. Or you can contest the election, like we saw in Bush v. Gore. But I mean, that's a totally separate ball of wax. Trump is only for law and order when it's deployed against his enemies, but he's constantly worked to obstruct investigations into his administration's misdeeds, as I talked about in my last video. He hasn't taken decisive action against right-wing extremists or white nationalists, and no, I don't consider his claim that he's going to declare the KKK and Antifa domestic terrorist organizations. I don't consider that to be decisive action. Why? Because A, as others have shown, Antifa is not a domestic terror organization. B, why are we applauding him for denouncing the KKK? That should literally be so easy. And C, most right-wing and white nationalist violence nowadays is not coming from the Klan. So it's really largely symbolic. Trump is bad for the country. He destabilizes us. The conventional wisdom is that in order to defeat the United States, another country would look to incite division and turmoil domestically here in the United States to try to get us to kind of collapse on ourselves and ruin us from within. The past 4 years have really accelerated us down that path, and I fear that another 4 years of Trump would bring that to fruition. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can stop that from happening. You can go out and vote on November 3rd so that Trump is out of a job come January 20th. But it's up to you. Thanks for watching, guys. Be safe.